Okay, welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
In this episode, we're going to dive into the nuanced topic of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, and if we think society has become too woke on gatekeeping this topic. As workplaces grow increasingly diverse, it's crucial for you as business leaders to build cultural competence. So we'll discuss practical strategies for navigating diverse work environments with our primary goal of being able to help you as leaders foster an inclusive atmosphere whilst fully respectfully engaging with and appreciating the richness of cultural diversity. But before we get into the main topic today, shall we catch up, Dawn? How you been?
Yeah, I've been really good, thank you. Busy few weeks, as always.
So we should let viewers know or listeners know actually that we're not in the studio today. So we're not in our normal comfort zone. We're doing this podcast remotely. The first one that's remote, right?
Absolutely. So all good fun. Actually, I had to tidy the house today before we made a start.
And where are you based, Dawn? So everybody knows what part of the world you're in.
So I'm up on near the East Coast in Lincolnshire in the UK. So miles and miles from nowhere.
Yeah, you literally live in the back of nowhere, don't you? I remember coming to see you and it took me like 17 hours to get there.
That's the whole idea. Nobody ever bothers me. What about
Brilliant.
you? How you doing?
Yeah, I'm really good. Jacob had his end of year review for which he got his little certificates. So he's doing really well in high school. So our listeners will know I talk about him all the time. And he started high school in September. So we had his first parents review thing this week. And he's smashing it. He's doing really well.
Oh, bless him. Bless him. Just
good.
For the viewers, I've had a chat with him already today on camera. So
he made me call you back, didn't he? He was like, I missed speaking to Dawn. So it's always good fun. Should we jump into this topic? It's a bit of a complex topic for workplaces in particular. So as always, I like to start the episode with a news article, and then I usually challenge you to give us your take on the news article. So let's start as we mean to go on. So this article, I'm just going to read it to you because it's quite in depth, and so I want to get the full bit around. So the Australian TV show The Block faced controversy after 5 competing teams were tasked with designing artwork for surfboards to be displayed in their homes. Contestants Ricky and Hayden from House 3 sparked backlash with their design choice. In a voiceover, host Sam Cam described their artwork as somewhat vaguely as an orange base paired with colourful circles and dots. However, Ricky and Hayden were more direct, referencing Indigenous-style artwork called Saltwater Dreamtime by well-known Indigenous artist Zachary Bennett Brooke. Acknowledging the potentially sensitivity around their design, Ricky remarked, "I hope they're not offensive to the culture if that's bad, but hopefully they'll see the inspiration that we've drawn from it." In an explainer titled, "Can Non-Indigenous People Do Aboriginal Art?" the Indigenous education organisation Koori Curriculum provides a firm answer. No, you can't. Remember, a non-Indigenous Australian can never create an Aboriginal artwork because only people from specific parts of the country can tell the story of that country. They are the only ones with authority to do so, the organisation states. So quite an interesting one, right, when it comes to cultural appropriation or appreciation. What's your take on this article for a start for 10?
Well, I guess the first thing to talk about is cultural appropriation, in that what we're talking about there is either not crediting or profiteering or not being respectful of a particular culture. I think this is a bit of a fine line one, actually, because the individuals who created the artwork didn't actually say that's what they were doing. They gave a specific shout out and they said it was where they drew inspiration from, as opposed to trying to copy or suggest it was something else and pass it off as their own. So it's a very interesting one. And this is the very delicate fine line between this topic of appropriation and appreciation.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I thought the same as you, really. I thought that, they'd caveated their work quite well by saying, look, we hope we're not offending anybody by doing this, but we've drawn real inspiration from artwork that we've seen. And I thought that was quite a nice nod to the fact that, they were appreciating the art of the Indigenous community rather than kind of appropriating it. But it is quite sensitive, and it's kind of leads us into today's topic quite nicely, doesn't it? Because I can hear friends of mine and colleagues that I've worked with saying, "Oh God, really? Do we really need to go down this road?" But actually, it is quite an important topic. So I wanted to just kind of start this bit by explaining what we mean by appreciation and appropriation, because I think it's quite important for people to understand what that means. So if we just break the words down a little bit. So cultural in its nature means about belonging or belief systems or ideas of a particular group or community, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about culture. When we talk about appreciating culture, so cultural appreciating, it's about celebrating those beliefs, that culture in its very right. But then when we talk about appropriation, this is where it kind of takes a little turn, I guess. And what we're talking about here is essentially taking something that doesn't belong to you, right? And it usually means either referring to a dominant group taking from, a minority group, or I should also say perhaps that minority group has been oppressed or in some way. And that's where the meanings of the words come from, and that's where it's kind of steeped in. But I can also hear then people saying, well, what's that got to do with work, right? What's that got to do with the workplace? So what's your take on that? What does it have to do with the workplace?
So I'd almost take it back a step, I guess, and talk about, you use the word cultural, and I would use the word cultural competence.
Mm,
So all we're talking about there is, do we actually understand the difference between cultures? Are we able to talk about them confidently and respectfully? And therefore, are we able to interact with other cultures? So that's what we mean at the most basic level in terms of some respect for different cultures. And that could be differences in cultures, that could be different values, that could be different histories, beliefs. It could be all sorts of different things that make up culture. And what we need to do to be culturally competent in business is to make sure that we can improve the interactions.
yeah.
So I'll tell you much more because I've created a 20-point plan for
I'm
people,
sure
which
you
we can
have.
share afterwards. But the point here is that to be culturally competent, we need to be able to challenge our own biases, going back to
Mm,
previous episodes. But I've also seen this in the last week done really badly,
yeah.
where one of our clients in Europe has just done some beautiful training on cultural competency to do work in Japan. And also, their Japanese colleagues have also done cultural training on how to do business in Europe. So, the first meeting we went to was a beautiful mix, and I say this with respect, of the wrong people bowing and the wrong people shaking hands because they both had the opposite cultures training.
Yeah.
And that just makes the mockery of the cultural competence.
Yeah, no, but very true. And I guess we are going to do a culture episode in the future, so we can dive into what it means culturally and how different cultures within an organization, particularly those in a global context, how they work together and how they kind of navigate those different backgrounds and histories that exist between their employees. But the point you made there is quite an important one, isn't there, about making sure that people understand the difference between each other. And I think for me, the key word that kind of undermines cultural competence for me is understanding, right? And that's all we're talking about when we talk about cultural competence. Do our colleagues, do our teams understand there are differences between our employees and differences between cultures? And when they understand those differences, they can be more respectful towards them, as opposed to kind of crossing any lines or crossing any bias lines that might exist within the organization.
Precisely that. And I think it comes back to that basic behavior we've talked about before about adaptability.
Yeah.
We can't always, in the same way we can't lead always in the same way, we can't do business with different cultures in the same way. And therefore, we need to be prepared to adapt our style. And not everybody's comfortable with that.
Yeah, you and I did a piece of work about, I want to say it was about 3 years ago now, where we were working with a global bank who was going through quite a big, extensive mergers and acquisitions program where they were acquiring smaller banks from around the world. And they brought these teams together. So they'd done all the work to prep for this acquisition piece of work. So, all of the thought went into how many people, how are we going to pay them, how are we going to integrate all our back office systems, and how are we going to, get the savings that makes this acquisition really worthwhile from us from a bottom line perspective. What they hadn't done was the cultural work and the planning for how you bring people together and get them to understand each other and work together in a seamless way. And so they ended up calling us in after the fact, as opposed to being involved in the planning of the M&A work. They called us in afterwards to try and help fix what became cultural issues for their organization, because they were having teams from different parts of the world trying to come together and work together, but not understanding how those cultures worked, and therefore they were clashing, and it was creating a really difficult work environment for either people in the US, people in Pakistan, or wherever it was. And so we had to do quite an extensive piece of work, didn't we, to help then raise that level of understanding, raise that level of cultural competence to bring those teams together after the fact. And it's always harder to do after, isn't it? If we'd have planned it, it would have been so much easier to bring those teams together in the first place.
But I remember that well because the whole process had been built on stereotypes.
Yep.
Nobody had actually done any quality research or education or asked anybody or had a conversation. It was based on information from 10 years ago that was stereotypical. And I'd love to say that's the only time we've seen that, but sadly not.
No, very, very, very true. And so I guess it makes me then lean into some of the other mistakes that employers have made or individuals have made over the years when it comes to appropriation or leaning into what potentially could be described as appropriation. So the most obvious one, or the most memorable one for me, was when the Ivy Group. So this is for those of you outside of the UK, the Ivy Group is quite a famous restaurant brand here in the UK, and they were expanding their brand into what they call Ivy Asia, and the Ivy Asia restaurant chains were opening up new venues all of the time. And there was a new venue opening in I want to say West London in the UK, and they used geisha girls on their advert locally, didn't they, to advertise the opening of this restaurant. I want to say it was in Kensington some way, but the backlash was huge, right? So the whole community and the news community just went, really, really challenging around using these geisha girls in the advert. And I guess the reason for that was because the Ivy Asia was seen as appropriating a particular culture to promote their restaurant brand without any understanding of the history behind and the belief system behind the geisha girls.
And I think, the reality is when you use these terms, people naturally get nervous because they're complex terms.
Yeah.
And the reality of that situation is anything that is to the detriment is appropriation. So if we're appearing to ridicule, as in the case that you're describing, or if we're appearing to gain financially or any of those elements are appropriation. Anything that gains or takes away from a culture is appropriation.
And in the case of the Ivy Asia restaurant chain, it was, I'm pretty sure, if I remember this correctly, they'd done an advert with geisha girls dressed up and bombing around London on tuk-tuks, the bikes things, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
And it
Yeah.
was really, it was ridiculed is the reality of why they kind of come unstuck. They hadn't really thought through the advertising campaign. And that kind of leans into where I think most organizations fall down, is because it's usually through advertising, marketing, or branding of some kind where the majority of appropriation claims come from, isn't it? So if you also remember in the UK, Jamie Oliver had created some, was it jerk rice that
Jerk
he'd made?
chicken or
Jerk chicken
yeah.
rice, yeah. And he hadn't done any acknowledgement of the Afro-Caribbean community from where this, the jerk recipe originated. And even another famous chef, so Levi Roots in the UK is quite a famous chef. He was the one that criticized Jamie for bringing out the jerk rice because he hadn't done the appreciation of the culture. He just was seen to be capitalizing on what was an increasingly popular brand or increasingly popular flavor. Jamie was seen to be capitalizing on that, having done no appreciation of where the recipe had come from or the roots of that.
And it's such an interesting one, because had there been some respect shown or some honour to the tradition, none of that would have happened. So there's a really contradictory case of Ramsay, actually,
Yeah.
who did open his Asian styled restaurants, but went and learnt and studied and bought an entire workforce to be authentic and was revered. But that doesn't get the same column inches, of course, because it's less controversial.
Yeah, I should just to be clear, Dawn was talking about Gordon Ramsay. I'm assuming he needs no introduction, but just for clarity's purposes, because I think he's well known pretty much around the world. But yeah, Gordon Ramsay was the kind of polar opposite to what Jamie Oliver had done, and his kind of Asian restaurants were steeped in that kind of history, that education, that learning, and the people he then employed had to follow, the authentic way of cooking in the right techniques and all of that good stuff as well. So it was a counter way of doing that, wasn't it? And received then therefore no attention as a result of that. Another example that I thought would be good to talk about here was sport. And you and I are both big sport enthusiasts. So, apologies to our listeners if you're not. We're leaning into this because we enjoy sport. But a really good example would be sports teams and using things like logos or mascots, those kind of things. And part of the reason they're seen as appropriation or appropriating a particular community is usually because those sports teams generate income, marketing, all of that kind of stuff. So the best example was the Washington Redskins, right, in the US, an NFL team, and the Native Americans had become increasingly offended by the logo. Not everybody, should be clear. So for balance, there was quite a lot of counter arguments to that. But ultimately, the logo they were using of the Native American, I think it was the Indian chief, that they put on there was causing offense. And in 2024, that, became, or 2023, it became increasingly difficult for them to hold on to that logo mascot, to the point where the owner of the club, I think, had said when he bought the club, I've no intention of changing it. It's, it's our history. It's been in place for 100 odd years and we're not changing it. And then even the owner kind of bowed to that kind of pressure. But the pressure, interestingly, ended up coming from the advertisers. So Nike and people like that ended up, because times were changing and the world was changing, even the people advertising with that team ended up saying, you're going to have to row back on this and you're going to have to change it. So after 100 years of using this logo or this branding, that NFL team then had to row back and change it. But it's a real good example in sports. It happens all the time, right?
It does. And, I also think that it can be hugely controversial too. But the reality is we don't need to overcomplicate this, which must be the topic I talk about the
Simply
majority of the time.
simplify everything. That's the answer. But it's a good point, isn't it? And I guess another thing that I kind of, when I hear this topic of appreciation or appropriation, there are times of the year when this tends to become a key issue, right, for employers or businesses. There are kind of peaks and troughs with this topic because we see certain holidays or celebrations throughout the year, and then people fall foul of those times because they lean in without, to your point, just thinking sensibly about some of this stuff or taking some advice before they lean into it. Do you have anything that springs to mind? I've got a couple of examples,
Yeah.
but Halloween's probably the most obvious one, right? Halloween and people dressing up at Halloween and, employees.
Yeah. And I think, again, that the reality is that people haven't taken the education behind some of these events. The one I always get uncomfortable with is Black History Month.
Yeah.
And not for any reason of not wanting to celebrate the good and the bad of what Black History Month represents, but also because that alienates a large proportion of difference. So, what I mean by that is that Black History Month is quite controversial towards Asian colleagues, for example. So, we need to be mindful that we're celebrating both. But I don't see as much focus on other celebrations.
Yeah.
So, therefore, my advice is always step away from the individual celebrations and be mindful of the themes, the behaviours, the common inclusive elements that we need to champion and support.
Yeah, we see it, don't we? Like we go into organizations and we're asked to help advise on their D&I strategies and things. And, we see their beautifully printed calendar with their 60 million different celebration days they're going to have. And we're like, lovely. And what about this day? Well, we haven't included that one. Oh, what about this day? Okay. So is your calendar inclusive or is your calendar not inclusive? And we do it in jest, right? Because there's a lot of effort that goes into doing those celebration days.
Good intent.
Good intent, yeah. But ultimately, what they're ending up doing is saying, well, you can't please everybody. And you can't, and well, no, you can't. And that's the point, right? So why are you choosing one particular group over another particular group when actually, if you'd like to create an inclusive culture, surely you should be celebrating the way we behave together, the way we go about our work, and helping people understand those things rather than leaning into one particular group or one other particular group.
And I think this is a really key point that you're making because the emotional connection to a particular celebration can often overrule common sense sometimes. And I say that with loads of love and respect because what we see, and I think at last count, there's 432 celebrations. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's something like that. 432 celebrations if we were to genuinely celebrate every individual diversity and event of difference. Now, practically, of course, you can't do that. But what people do is have an emotional connection to certain celebrations and put lots of effort into that without the consideration of the impact of doing that. So the impact can be hugely isolating for individuals who don't relate to that particular celebration, or indeed, sorry, I'm on a rant now, or
Go for it.
indeed, we end up doing something completely inappropriate, whether we're serving a particular menu in the canteen, or I have seen a beautiful example, and you couldn't make this up, whereby during Ramadan, one of our clients shared posters around their building to celebrate, to promote a family day they were running. And the key headline was that was going to be a hog roast in the middle of Ramadan. And they'd done some beautiful education around what Ramadan meant and then completely blew it out the water with something as stupid and ill thought out as that.
Yeah, we've seen that quite a lot with some of our retail clients that we've worked with over the years, where they've kind of, doing this big celebration thing or round the world kind of cuisines in their fresh foods section and stuff, and then they go putting inappropriate foods on the end of the same aisle, or without having thought
Bacon
through their
Pringles,
approach.
yeah.
Yeah, just really silly things that they do. And again, there's often no malice, but they just don't understand. And then they're seen as, well, you're leaning into this festival because you're trying to make money from it, but you're not actually understanding the why the festival exists in the first place, why these cultural celebrations are important to our community. And I understand that challenge when it gets put that way, because as much as it can be frustrating, if you're going to lean in, do your homework, right? And understand what it is you're leaning into.
And I think, the basics here are just that. They're basics. We shouldn't be starting to pretend we're experts in 432 different things. We need to, of course, educate ourselves, whether that's reading, learning, researching. We also need to be really open to criticism of our approach or our own views around different cultures. We need to be absolutely aware of what symbolism means and how
Yeah.
important symbols and logos and approaches absolutely are. And we can do that in a really positive way with some cultural exchanges.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, Sharing information, having really real empathy for being in other people's shoes. You and I have been extremely fortunate,
Yeah.
personally and professionally, to travel the world. And have we had to be immensely curious to get that right and spend time in the country ahead of trying to suggest we understand a culture? Absolutely, we have. But that's had to come from some difficult conversations, being really clear we want to learn and hearing history that sometimes people don't want to hear.
Yeah. Well, it's equally as important, though, to respect the differences in
Mhm.
cultures, right? So it's very easy for us, particularly when we're from a westernized society where, freedoms are, a apparent and easily accessible, and all of the good things that we get from living in a westernized society. When we go to the Middle East, as an example, you and I traveling, you have to sit back and accept that they're going to direct their questions and their conversation to me in certain countries, right? And
Mhm.
that might be infuriating for you because there's no difference in terms of seniority between us, but they will automatically direct their conversation at me because I am a male and you're a female. We might not agree with that approach, but we're mindful of the fact that it's their country, it's their society, it's their culture, and we need to be respectful of that. And if we can somehow influence it while we're there and have a positive conversation around it, then we will. But we can't change them. We can't make them behave differently. We have to be respectful of their culture and respectful of their society. And that's okay, right? Because it's theirs and
Mhm.
it belongs to them, and it's not for us to change that as well. And I feel like I'm gone off on a bit of a tangent, but it's an
So,
important point, right?
yeah, and just to tap that back in, really, we also have to go back to some standard advice we give here in that
Yeah.
if we're a global organization, we have to have some standard operating procedures around the world that guide and support us with that. Are we talking about that we operate under the law of the land that we're working in today, or are we operating over a global corporate piece of governance? And that might look slightly different. That might be in excess of the local laws or the local environment. And we need to be really clear what we're talking about.
Yeah. Nice. I love that. I guess another one for me then, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it's Halloween, right? So it's a
Mm.
big celebration, usually in Western style countries. But um, our employees then attend events and sometimes workplace events dressing up for Halloween and choosing a variety of different outfits. When I was a kid, Halloween was about you dressed up as a ghost or a witch, right? But nowadays, you seem to be able to dress up as anything and do lots of different kind of outfits and things. But this is usually a hot peak in terms of a season for appropriation claims or people being offended by dress. And I'm thinking of a couple of examples here is when people do blackface or brownface dress up when they're not from that culture or origin, or people wearing bindis on their forehead without understanding the religious significance of that for their, or even as far as somebody dressing up as if they've got a disability when they haven't, and these kind of things. And we see these grievances quite a lot around that time of the year because people think it's fun and think they're doing something, but they maybe have crossed the mark, or they've offended one of their other colleagues as a result of that.
So if we go back to the roots of All Hallows Eve, it's actually a pagan ceremony. And there are many religions across the world who take huge offense to even that celebration. We look at a country like Mexico, for example, that uses All Hallows Eve as the Day of the Dead. And they celebrate their dead relatives. But there are certain colours, purple particularly, that if one was to wear to a meeting on that day would be hugely offensive. And these are the intricacies that we need to understand if we're doing business.
Yeah, and it's a good point, isn't it? Because we travel a lot. We're a global organization, so we have to have crib sheets, for want of a better description, don't we? So when we're sending colleagues to different countries around the world, we send them with a bit of a culture map that says, here are the kind of norms and things to expect in this country, this society. And it's not exhaustive by any stretch. So, but we do say to our colleagues, look, it's your responsibility to kind of do some research on the people you're meeting and the environment and all of that good stuff. But here's a starter for 10. And I always think as an organization that operates globally, that's a kind of minimum standard you should be providing your employees to understand. Because again, as a gay man, there are certain parts of the world where if I travel to, I could be at risk, or our company insurance would be null and void if I went there, right? So we need to be mindful of these things, and all of these things can create a cultural map for your organization to help you with that kind of raising people's understanding and raising that cultural competence we talked about at the beginning.
And I think this comes back to some basic respectful curiosity, doesn't it? When we visit a new country, yes, we have our beautiful crib sheets. Yes, we have what we call our batteries of information, and we'll have done our research and we'll know how to speak 10 sentences in a language and all of that good stuff.
Badly,
we do.
Usually.
Yeah, very badly. But the reality comes that nothing replaces experience of living in that culture. And therefore, the majority of people are immensely proud of their culture and are very happy to educate and talk through what that means. And one of the first things I'd recommend anybody does is have a conversation with 2 or 3 local individuals to understand the reality, because what the textbook says and what it looks like on the ground are 2 entirely different things.
Yeah, just be curious. So just one of your favorite sayings, right? Just be curious, ask some questions, those kind of things. Okay, so keeping on the dressing up theme then, just to be a little bit controversial, I want to talk about Moana, the Disney princess, because I don't know whether you've seen this. There is a video that goes around on social media, and it's of a man and a woman having a chat about appreciation and appropriation. And this chap says, the lady says, so all my life I never had a Disney princess to look up to, right? They were all white, they were all whatever, right? So they never had this Disney princess character to look up to as a female person until they created Moana, right? And Disney had created the Moana character. And she was really, pleased that finally they had something for her now daughter to look up to, and to have a Disney princess that could be relative and representative of her and her background. This chap then says, so on that, how do you feel about my daughter, who's white, dressing up as Moana? So she loves Moana, right? And she wants to put on the Moana outfit and dress up as Moana, the Disney princess. And this lady said, no, she shouldn't, because that's appropriation. And this guy was like, see, this just, how can you do that, right? It's, you either want them to be a princess and rah, and I just thought I'm going to ask Dawn to give us her take on Moana in this episode.
Well, I'm actually going to layer it with Wicked as well, because that has created similar debate, of course. And the reason I'm smiling is that last week I went to the hairdressers, and I was really interested to hear this.
Your hair looks lovely,
discussion.
By the way. Sorry.
No, it's fabulous, isn't it? Thank you. I heard this exact discussion about Wicked from 3 ladies who were a few chairs along. Well, I love stuff like that. So I turned up the ears and was listening. And they were outraged for the same reason, because they were saying, we've got our children, and they were talking about children under 10 wanted to go to a Christmas party dressed as the black characters, and their school had said no. And they were very much around, well, if they went as a character from Frozen, it would be okay, but they can't emulate the character because it's considered to be appropriation. And it's double standards, is it?
Yeah.
What do we think?
Yeah, well, look, I think it is a bit of double standards. I mean, I understand why people are really sensitive around it, and therefore they tread carefully to the point where they just say no, right? And that's the reality of where we are, right? We've got to a place in society where it's so sensitive that rather than defend your position, it's easier just to say no, we're not doing it. But I'm sorry, if my daughter wanted to dress up as Moana because she loved her, I'd be straight out the next day and I'd buy her an outfit and she could do that. Because in my mind, that's us as a family celebrating that culture and celebrating that representation. And to have a little girl of a different background wanting to be you, surely that's what representation is around as well. It's not just,
aspirational.
Around. Yeah. So I guess that's where my head's at with it, because it is difficult. And I understand why people police this too much, and they kind of, they end up just saying no. But equally, I think it's a real shame that we don't celebrate cultures that haven't had that airtime or haven't had that kind of, prosperity in the past. We're doing it now, but we're cutting it off from everybody, and that feels silly to me, counterproductive at least.
It's back to this fear of ridicule, isn't it? If we were to emulate the people we admire, and you were crystal clear about what that looked like, that's all well and good. But there's a fear that that would be ridiculing. And I think that's where people are petrified of being cancelled.
Yeah. No, very, very true. And I've got another one for you. And this one's a bit personal for me, so maybe I might rant about this bit. But so a little while ago, and this has become quite a hot topic, I think, recently, Rupert Everett, who's a British actor, was cited in a newspaper for saying that a cultural appropriation is a load of nonsense. And this was because, of course, for only gay actors to play gay characters in movies. And I found that quite interesting. And so for the benefit of our listeners, the reason I think a lot of people are calling for gay actors to play gay roles is because historically gay actors never had the same opportunities as straight actors would get in Hollywood. Or, if you were found to be gay, which is why a lot of people stayed in the closet, if you were found to be gay, then you wouldn't get the opportunities given to you. And so now that being gay is much more open and much more accepted in society, people are calling for only gay actors to play gay roles. And now I have a take on this, but I'm keen to understand yours as well. So do you want to go first, or shall I go on a rant?
You can happily rant, by all means. My head had gone to disability. So you carry on.
Yeah. Because there's lots of disability acting now that we haven't seen for a long time as well. So much more representation. So I guess on the acting bit, I think it's ridiculous that only gay characters or gay people can play gay characters. I just think it's utterly ridiculous. In its very nature, it's acting. So if you're a straight person and you're playing a gay character, you are acting just the same as if you were a gay person playing a gay character or playing a straight character. Because if we go down that road, can gay people not play straight characters then? Because that's also appropriation, right? And this is why I think it's a bit ridiculous. However, I'm going to balance my rant about it being ridiculous. I'm going to balance this by saying there's a better way of achieving authenticity for these roles, and that's through the directing, the writing of the script work, and the research into the experiences of gay people so that the characters that they're acting have authenticity throughout the storyline. That's much more important to me than whether the person playing the role is gay or not, right? It's much more important that the authenticity of the character is correct. And we can achieve that through the writing. You can achieve that through the research that the actor has to go through in order to make sure the role is authentic, those kind of things. And it also means when they make a movie of my life that Brad Pitt, who's clearly going to play me in the movie, can spend some time with me doing his research, right?
Absolutely. That would be an interesting casting.
You trying to say you wouldn't play me?
I think it's a genius casting, clearly. I think it's a really interesting topic. And on the whole, I agree with what you're saying. But we do need to be mindful that we're creating opportunity and not ridicule. So again, I come back to that point that, my head immediately went to disability, where there was a huge, particularly within the UK, a huge outcry about the lack of physical disability representation on our screens. And what has happened within literally a 5-year window is that within some of our most popular soap operas, for example, we now have 40% representation of physical disability, whereas society, we know, is about 5%.
Yeah.
Now, therefore, what we do is we fatigue people by going the other way in terms of overrepresentation. And therefore, it becomes a topic of ridicule, which in turn appropriates the issue.
Yeah, 100%. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Organizations and we talked about this in previous episodes, it's that pendulum swing, isn't it? Right. So it's not where it needs to be. So let's swing the pendulum. And then it goes so far the other way that it ends up becoming a topic of ridicule or appropriation, as opposed to hitting the mark and being really meaningful in representation and authentic in the storyline. And this is my point about the gay characters, because it's much more important to me that the character is representative and the storyline of the character is authentic than it is to whoever plays it, because that's acting. And it doesn't really matter who plays that for me. What's more important is whether the character is authentic. And as a gay man, I can resonate with that character, or other gay men can resonate with that character. That's the bit for me that's really important. So again, when we think about workplaces, and I'm linking this back, when we've got TV studios or production companies who are casting and thinking about these things, we don't want that pendulum to swing so far the other way that you're bringing ridicule to this topic. Actually, what we want it to be is based in real sentiment and real authenticity. And that's where the money spot is for inclusion, right? Because you then make your audience feel included as opposed to excluded. Because if your representation is too far the other way, your audience won't feel included. They'll think that it's not a fair representation of the world that we live in, or that it's not a fair representation of a particular storyline. And so we have to get that right and not let the pendulum swing too far the other way. And not just because we don't want that much representation. It's because it brings ridicule and therefore appropriation to the topic.
I agree. And I think if we go right back to the roots and the history of this whole topic, it would be remiss of us not to make mention to all characteristics, of course, whether that be race, critical race theory, whether that be the history behind evolution, even. All of these elements impact our thinking around appropriation and indeed appreciation. Our own stereotypes do, our own generational experiences do, our own backgrounds do. So anything, coming back to your point, that is authentic in terms of substance, not necessarily the need to be representative of that diverse characteristic, is critical.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm smiling as you were talking then, right? Because I feel like I'm going to be a little bit controversial now. So hold on to your hats. What do you think then about... So let me add a bit of context because I lost my train of thought for a second, but I think it's important that I get this right. So following on from the Black Lives Matter movement, appropriation became quite significant, right? And appreciation became quite significant as a kind of byproduct of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened a few years back. As a result of that, what we saw, particularly here in the UK, but it did happen in other countries around the world, what we saw was a removal of things like statues or artifacts that were relating back to things like slavery, colonialism, those kind of things. And I think of the most obvious one of that for me was in Bristol, a city in the UK, where a well-known slave merchant or whatever his descriptor, what his title was, they pulled down statues. And something makes me really uncomfortable about that, right? And not because I think we should be celebrating that individual for the work that they did and the behaviors that they demonstrated back then, but actually it makes me really uncomfortable that we're erasing history in that way, because if you erase history, we can't learn from it. And so the next generation of individuals don't see these statues, they don't see these things, therefore they don't understand the cultural significance of these things. And it's not about celebrating that individual in a statue, for example, but it's about appreciating the journey society has come on since that point for me. So I'm just not comfortable with this kind of erasing history in what seemed to be the way it happened over the last few years.
But what you're describing is rife in everyday life. We sanitize anything that's controversial because we're not good at curiosity.
Yeah.
And we're not good at having a sensible, educated discussion to reach a conclusion which is far more conciliatory than pulling down a statue.
Yeah.
And therefore, the easy option is, let's just remove that reference. Let's just remove
Yeah.
that statue, because we haven't got the skills or the psychological safety, or we feel uncomfortable to have those difficult questions and conversations.
Yeah. And I can hear the counter arguments to this. So I'm going to just play them for some balance, right? Because, people would argue, but they've been up and statues represent celebrations of things, right? And I get that. And they've been up for a long time. And we instead haven't celebrated Black history, and we haven't celebrated some of our Black heroes in everyday life the way we have perhaps some white heroes or white historical figures and stuff. So I understand that, and I think that's a counterbalance. But it's the same principle of representation, isn't it? Right? So you can't level one down to level one up, because two wrongs don't make a right.
No.
And that's the point. So I'm all for us raising the profile of Black key figures, or not just race here. I'm talking more widely across the characteristics. I'm definitely for raising some of that up, bringing it more to the fore so that we can celebrate more some of our diverse history as a country, as a society. But we don't have to remove or sanitize everything else in order to do that, right? You can have two things happen at the same time. That's okay. And because all you're doing when you do those things is you're alienating another part of society, or you're trying to erase history that people can learn from. And if we don't learn from our history, whether it was good or bad, then, we've got real problems. So, you could counter this argument around race theory and some of those, the slave trade and the history, you could counter that with, well, then we shouldn't have Auschwitz, right? We should get rid of the Auschwitz Museum because it celebrates all that Hitler did and that behavior. Well, of course, we would never do that, right? Because we want to understand and learn from the mistakes of the past. And our German colleagues will talk about the fact that every child in Germany has to visit a concentration camp in part of their curriculum so that they too must learn the mistakes of the past. So again, if we cancelled those things, we're not able to learn, and we should apply the same theory to some of this other appropriation stuff that is being accused of appropriation in this country, so that we can, if we erase it all, we don't get the learning opportunity. That's my counterbalance argument to that anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a big one.
It really is. And then I'm going to just do this final one before we move on and do the so what bit of our episode. But I guess one of the things we always promise to do is have the difficult conversation, right? And so I'm going to counter this whole topic of appreciation and appropriation by saying, and I hear this, people talking about how ridiculous it is that we even need to have these conversations about appreciation and appropriation, and how it's all just complete woke nonsense, right? And we don't even need to understand that stuff. It's just ridiculous. But I'm going to counter that by saying my response to those people would be, yet it's those same voices that then get really frustrated about immigrants coming to this country and trying to change our laws and change our society about, or that not speaking English, etc. So your argument is kind of, you counter argument your own argument yourselves, because in one breath you're saying we don't need to talk about all of this, and in the next breath you're getting really protective about our own culture and our own societal background. And I say, and I have that argument with people where I say, but your argument doesn't stand up, does it? Because in the same breath you get frustrated with immigrants in this country trying to change your culture. And so you can't have that it's, nonsense for a different culture, but it's okay for your own. That's not how it works, right?
No, absolutely. And sharp intake of breath. We come back to education, tolerance, understanding. We need a society to evolve. And I do think this is the case that's happening, where we can have these difficult and robust conversations without conflict.
No, we can, and we should caveat that by saying I don't suggest you do this in the staff canteen, right? Because it's very difficult to
Please.
moderate that. A lot of what we're talking about here is societal issues, but
Yeah.
they do bleed into the workplace. So almost a seamless link there. Shall we go into the so what? What can leaders be thinking about or do when it comes to cultural appreciation and appropriation in their workplaces? What are your top tips?
So the first thing I'd say is make it easy for your teams. Provide some materials or some training, like we've talked about, some help guides per country on business etiquette, food etiquette, basic understanding of a particular culture. And communicate that and put that into your standard operating procedures, either for people traveling or for people doing business remotely with other cultures. So that would be my first one. The second is that if you're a global organization or indeed a local organization with multiple cultures operating within you, um, talk openly and communicate about cultural competence and what that actually means. Because even in small countries, we have different regions or different states which have completely different cultures. So it's immensely important. I know you're going to step in and go Wales and England, but before you do that, we also need to be mindful about challenging ourselves in this, because I know that I certainly, and I've had the pleasure of traveling to many countries, have a vision in my mind before I go of what to expect. And 99.9% of the time, I'm completely wrong. And we've got to be able to challenge our own stereotypes. So that's not necessarily a business piece of advice, it's a personal piece of advice. In terms of appropriation, I come back to the point about being mindful of symbolism, being respectful of that basic definition, that we're not doing anything that would ridicule or be to the detriment, whether it be financially or in any other way, to a culture. And there's many ways we can do that: listen, read, educate, ask. And again, think about that exchanging of cultural experiences. We've done some quite interesting things where we've done some cultural quizzes with our teams
Yeah.
and with some of our students in different environments, where we've given people the opportunity to explore what seem some very simple questions about what you can and you can't do. And by the end of it, people are like, whoa, I didn't know
So much we
90% of
don't
that.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, never stop learning.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think I think everything you said there is really accurate and important for organisations to think about. The only thing I would kind of challenge on, not challenge, but add to what you've said, I guess, is don't do everything if you don't have to, right? So understand the makeup of your workforce to begin with. So don't do this if you don't need to do this, because there are other things that you can do and get a better return on or get more impact from. So don't do this at the cost of something else if it's not important for the makeup of your workforce. But extend that review out to your customer base as well, because it might not be important internally, but it could well be important externally. And I use the NHS in the UK here, so the National Health Service, is an example of this, because again, this is the stuff that D&I managers could and should be looking at for the NHS. Do your systems and processes work for the communities you serve? And if not, that's the stuff you should be trying to challenge and change, so that we're not making inappropriate mistakes around this stuff. We're not allowing stereotypes to determine the way we respond to these type of things. So those kind of things would be where I would start. We often talk about in your strategies for global organizations, we call them the glocalized strategy. So you have a global strategy, but make sure that you localize it so that it's relevant and important for the teams on the ground and relatable for them, so that they match the kind of environments they're working in. You've already talked about the kind of crib sheets, but I'd extend that a little bit further by talking about crib sheets for our teams internally to use, right? So not just when they're traveling. Marketing is a really good example of that. If you're going to go down the road of leaning into a particular festival or celebration event across the year, do your research and have some gate stage review process in there, so that somebody who's not involved in developing the strategy or the initiative has the opportunity to review it from a customer perspective, so that before you do that, you're preventing any kind of mistakes. There will always be mistakes. People will still continue to make mistakes. That's okay, as long as you're learning from them and you're kind of being curious to it. But at least have a gate stage review in place so that you can double check before something goes out the door, particularly for marketing and sales purposes, because that does border that line into appropriation in a way where you're kind of benefiting from or profiteering from culture without having done your research and your background bit. And then a couple of other ones from me would just be: give credit where it's due. So if you're leaning into a particular culture, give that culture the credit that it deserves as a result of that, right? Because it's very common for me, and I see it a lot in retail in particular, where organizations will celebrate a particular festival and they don't talk about that festival. They just celebrate the name of it and they lean into it, but they don't do the history bit behind it. They don't give credit to the cultural significance of that festival. So everybody would walk around a supermarket, for example, and know that it was Ramadan, right? Because it's all over the place, or, that it's, a different particular festival. Diwali is a really good example, right? So everybody would know. But do they understand what Diwali means? And does the supermarket
Mm-hmm.
make any effort to help customers understand what Diwali means? So my question to them is, are you just appropriating the festival for your own ends, or are you actually celebrating that festival and helping everybody else, who your customers and your community, understand what the festival is all about and why you're celebrating it? So that's the bit for me. Give the credit where it's due and lean into it properly rather than just kind of be seen to be appropriating it. And my
Absolutely.
final tip for employers is, don't be afraid of focus groups. Focus groups are a really good way for you to understand topics you don't understand, or test your work on a bigger society of a bigger community, if you like. So get people to test your marketing campaigns on them, or test your understanding on these focus groups. The richness that you'll get back from different people's understanding is huge. And it leans into your point, Dawn, about let's be more curious and let's ask questions and let's not over police this stuff, but let's just create an environment where if we're going to do something, let's do it properly. Let's not do it half-heartedly. Let's not just have curry in the canteen because it's Diwali. Let's understand what Diwali actually means. Let's help our colleagues understand the meaning behind it. And then we can celebrate and do the bits that are important because it's representative of our workforce or it's representative of our customer base. And if it isn't, then, don't lean into that if you've got other things to do in your D&I strategy that are more important.
Exactly that. Exactly.
Do we think we've given our listeners enough knowledge and information on this one? The only other one I would just add in is the mergers and acquisitions one, because that's probably the one we see most with our client base being around the world, is organizations who are involved in mergers, acquisitions. Please do the planning up front, right? Don't do it as an afterthought, because it's a lot harder to unpick this stuff when it's happened rather than planning for it. So it's much cheaper and more effective if you plan it as part of the acquisition work rather than do it as a reaction to that work. That's the only one that I'd add in.
No, I love that. Love that. Uh,
Awesome.
if listeners want to reach out, I have got the infographic of 20 things to do. So please get in touch if you want a copy.
Yeah, definitely. Always willing to share and share alike. Okay, so it's this point in the show, we move over to listeners' questions. So this is the point where we hand over the mic to you as listeners, and you can ask us any question you like on the topic of diversity and inclusion, and we promise you that we will answer it, no holds barred. There's very little we've heard that shocks us, but that's your challenge. If you still want to shock us or try and shock us, feel free to ask us a question. So today, because we're remote, we don't have a hidden envelope, but I do have an email, which I'm just opening now on my iPad to find the questions that we've got. So first question up, Dawn, is how can global organizations handle the topic of cultural competency without just a Western lens on the topic? That's a really good question, actually, isn't it?
Great
Because
question.
it's so easy for us to lean into the Western lens because that's where we're from. So yeah, do you want to take a go at answering that one first?
Yeah, so we come back to our own biases and stereotypes, and therefore, unless we have experience of the culture, it's never going to be authentic. So we lean in, we share information. I talk about this cultural exchange approach, making sure whether through focus groups or indeed often within our own organisations, we've got individuals who will support with this. Clear communication. We're looking at opening a factory in China. I would like to speak with a range of colleagues to understand what we need to consider. And again, don't overthink it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I guess the only thing I'd add to that is, it's not our job to change the world, right? So be mindful of that. Just because we're from a westernized society, and in westernized countries, we have lots of freedoms and we have lots of privileges, that doesn't mean you can change the culture of every society that you operate in, because that's not in your gift. You can try and influence your colleagues, and you can encourage your colleagues to adhere to your cultural values and your processes, policies, and procedures, but you can't change societal cultures. So you have to embrace them. You have to lean in. And just like any organization, if you're operating in a global landscape, you're going to have a multitude of different cultures. Your challenge as leaders or D&I practitioners is to be able to bring all of those different cultures together and still get them to do great work to contribute to your overall success as an organization. That's no small challenge. It's big, but you can't just force everybody to do a one-size-fits-all model. That's not the answer. That won't work. You can't change society either. So you have to create an environment, and this is where we come back to all of the time. This is about creating inclusive environments where people can come, do great work, and contribute to your overall success as an organization. So remember what's in your actual gift to do rather than trying to fix societal challenges around the world. Okay.
That.
Next one I would say is, what is your advice to brands that want to celebrate different cultures in their products without commodifying or exploiting those cultures? So I think we've answered some of that, right, in our last segment, didn't we? Because we talked about particularly retailers leaning into festivals and things. Do your research, make sure you're actually celebrating whatever religious event or celebration event it is, rather than just kind of being seen to be appropriate in the event to make a bit more money from it. Lean in, I guess. Is there anything you want to add to that one?
Just make sure you're not ridiculing, you're not stereotyping something in your design. And again, you could apply that across all characteristics.
I cannot express enough the importance of having a gate stage review. And if you don't have the internal capabilities for that, that's where you should be spending your consultancy money. Get a consultant to independently be that gate stage review for you so that you don't fall foul for it. It's far more expensive to make the mistake than to have a stage review in place. So if you're down that road, make sure you've got a stage review process in place. And mostly your colleagues can do that for you. Right? If you've got a diverse colleague group, they can do that for you. But if you haven't, then put it in place. Okay, next question we've got is, how can we ensure we get this right and know where to draw the line so we don't create an issue and erase history by being too woke? Things like sports teams' names, logos, mascots, statues of historic figures as prime examples. So we've covered a lot of this, so I'm not going to reiterate all of that. But, focus groups are a great way to test whether what you're doing today is relevant. So if you need some help with focus groups, there are plenty of people that can help, but Dawn and I will help you or point you in the right direction. If you want to get in touch, we can help with that. But focus groups are a really good way to test what you've got in place. And then final question, how do you avoid falling into the trap of performative allyship or being overly cautious to the point where it feels insincere or patronizing? I like that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a real cliche, but it's back to being authentic, and also being brave enough to say, I don't know, I don't get it. Tell me more. Help me understand this so that I can really be genuine. Because I've seen this all too often where people profess to be an ally, and we can't profess ourselves we're an ally. We need somebody else to tell us we're their ally. And the only way we can do that is by genuinely having provided that service.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing for me is understand what allyship means, right? Because in its very nature, I think most people think allyship is about fighting, defending, right? And actually so it can involve those things, but allyship is about being a good friend. And as a good friend, if I don't know something, I'll ask the question and I will say to my friend, tell me a bit more about that. What is it you're talking about? Because they're my friend, right? And therefore they won't ridicule me for asking a question. They'll embrace my curiosity and probably tell me a bit more about it. That's allyship too. It isn't just about fighting. It isn't just about defense or protest. It's also about understanding and being curious, and ask your friends to help you, because that's good allyship too. So don't be afraid to do that as well. But, make sure whatever you're doing is steeped in sincerity, i.e. there's a point to it. Because if you're just doing it for the sake of it, it's really obvious and people will see it and they will look at it as you just lip service. It's not authentic. It's not deep rooted. So, same point applies. If there's no point to it, don't do it. because there's no impact. In fact, you end up having a negative impact. So cool. Okay, so that's it for listeners' questions this week, this time around. If you want to ask a question in the future on any topic to do with diversity and inclusion, you can get in touch with Evan at metimer.global. So his email address is simply evan@metimer.global. And we promise we will answer unfiltered, completely honest. We'll answer your questions for you in the future as well. So this brings us to our final segment of the show, Dawn, which is woke or joke. And this time round, it's me that gets to ask the question. So you're ready for this one? And I should confess, I've had help with this one. So you'll remember in a previous episode, I asked for some help. And a listener has sent me some help. So this isn't mine. So I'm hoping this is going to work and I'm going to get a point on the back of this. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, this is a recurring segment we do each time we do an episode called Woke or Joke. One of us has to ask the other one or tell the other one a story, and the other person has to guess whether it's a woke, true, or joke, false story. So I'm not doing very well. So I've reached out to some of our listeners for some help, and this is where we got to.
Gosh.
Okay. So is it true then that a jury awarded nearly $600,000 to an employee who refused to use a biometric hand scanner for clocking in and out, believing that it represented allegiance to the Antichrist? The court upheld the verdict, finding that the employer failed to reasonably accommodate the employee's sincerely held religious belief. Is that woke or joke?
Ooh, so there's a few layers there, because there's a belief which carries the same weight as a religion. That's a big payout.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's that bit that makes me curious that it's perhaps not, more so than the content, actually, because a $600,000 payout would have to be... No, I'm going to say it's not.
So you're saying joke?
Joke.
And it is woke! Yay! It's true. It's absolutely true. And thank you to the listener who sent that in for me. You finally have given me a point on the board at long last.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? And it leans into those differences between religion and belief system as well. So I thought it was a really good one. So I nabbed that up and put it straight in for this episode. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's it for another episode of You Must Be Woken. Thank you for joining us. I hope if after listening to us today, you can take at least just one nugget away from what we've talked about, then we will have done our jobs and we would have shone a light on the difference between things that are too woke or not too woke. And so hopefully you've enjoyed our episode as much as we've enjoyed being here. So until next time, bye from me.
Bye from me.
This episode is brought to you by Metimer, the online platform that measures inclusion. The Metimer platform moves beyond the DEI initiatives and allows businesses to measure the real-time impact on culture as well as their financial impact on their bottom line. The Metimer platform is a collaboration between data scientists, digital experts, and cultural change experts to bring substance to the topic of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's time for businesses to move past diversity quotas and start understanding the real impact and opportunities of an inclusive culture. To find out more, visit www.metimer.global.